Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss Trump's demolition of the East Wing of the White House, his musing about pursuing a third term, and the dismissal of charges against Andrew Tate. I'm joined by Ashley Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So I think for all of us who grew up watching the great Aaron Sorkin drama, The East Wing, this has been a very rough week. Or wait, no, that was The West Wing. So what is the East Wing of the White House? What purpose has it served?
My understanding is it had a movie theater in it. So that was kind of cool.
It's definitely the
if you were
the least distinguished wing. Maybe, I don't know, did it have a swimming pool or something? Bowling alley? Or you kind of hear about these things that are in the White House or were once in the White House. Maybe that's where all this kind of random stuff has been kept. I thought, Ross Douthat had a good column on this in the New York Times, arguing that it makes a fair bit of sense to build a permanent event space at the White House, because whenever there's a gala, large dinner, ball, whatever, that the president wants to host at his own residence, he has to put up a tent in the White House yard. So I thought Ross made a good point there, but there's really been a surprising amount of agita about this, and why is that? Why do people find this a bit disturbing?
I think it becomes a concrete manifestation of the notion of a sort of taking of a wrecking ball to all kinds of norms and politesse and processes and procedures that obviously we can find many examples of this administration doing that. And it's an interesting case of it, in part because I'm not really convinced that many people who are sort of mourning this destruction had any particularly clear idea of what the East Wing was, what function it served. And so, I think tend to imagine it's some sort of storied place, but it would seem that it kind of isn't. It was something of a sort of all-purpose space for kind of small-scale entertaining, but was not particularly important to the operations of the White House. And I mean, it was interesting. They had a New York Times op-ed by Patty Davis, talking about sort of mourning the destruction of implying that this, amounted to a kind of whole-scale destruction of the White House. So obviously it has that kind of symbolic potency. And I did want to connect it to one other thing I saw a news item about this morning, which is the discontinuation of the penny. So these are sort of examples of the kind of thing that this administration is doing that, the way that Ross Douthat frames it in the op-ed that Matthew brought up is that it's an example of this administration just kind of getting stuff done and not really caring, not getting bogged down in procedures. And that this is, and he sort of argues the Democrats and progressives' failure to do this kind of thing is part of their problem, and that makes a good amount of sense. If you're a progressive, then presumably you want to enact change, and yet it's striking that on various fronts, there's been a kind of inertia. I mean, obviously there are areas of kind of aggressive activism and action, that we could find in the record of the Biden White House, but on the other hand, there is this kind of tendency to stand on ceremony and get trapped in these dynamics of inertia. And so basically the demolition of the East Wing and the discontinuation of the penny seem like examples of stuff that, people sort of had a vague sense it was stupid. We still have this, stupid. We were still doing this. And so in a sense, this administration is finding these pieces of low-hanging fruit and just getting things done without really worrying too much about who it offends in the process. And then you get this kind of weird small c conservative nostalgia as the reaction of like, oh, we're losing the penny or we're losing the East Wing. We hardly knew ye. And, they pave paradise and put up a parking lot. And this is, as Ross said, you could sort of connect it to YIMBY, to sort of left-wing YIMBYism and the fact that it's very hard to, this is kind of the abundance critique of progressive politics. That's just very hard to kind of get things done because of this proceduralism. And then on the other hand, what Ross points out is that when they do get things done, those things tend to be kind of unpopular and unpleasant. And the example he brings up is the Obama library and the new Obama presidential library in Chicago, which seems to be roundly regarded as pretty hideous architecturally. And so it's like, you mostly don't get things done and get bogged down in procedure, but then when you do get things done, they tend to be kind of hideous and unpopular. And so that's that. I think quite a good take on this. The thing that again strikes me is, there isn't nothing to there. There are some areas where I think the critique of this administration's sort of roughshod approach to all kinds of things is valid. But there are also areas where it's just doing things that are not particularly, ideologically significant or charged, like discontinuing the penny. Obviously, people will say about this proposed ballroom that it's this vainglorious kind of megalomaniacal scheme to aggrandize Trump himself. And perhaps we can get into that in the discussion of the third term fantasy. But, as far as this goes, it seems like there's a sense in which it's just an attempt to, get some practical thing done that might otherwise have just been bogged down in this sort of irrational inertia. And so what's interesting, I'd say, or perhaps what's more interesting is the liberal response being one of this kind of instinctive nostalgia for just, respect for norms and procedures for their own sake, which seems like it just guarantees that you have a pretty inert politics in all sorts of ways. And, there's some sense of, okay, this is, once again, just the party, the Democratic Party that is trapped in this kind of vague nostalgia for some bygone era when supposedly things were, there was this consensus that everybody accepted and, unquestioningly embraced. And if we could just somehow restore that, then we could, and I mean, it's been interesting to actually see people sort of saying like, well, the first thing a Democratic president has to do when they get into power again is to demolish Trump's new East Wing and replace it with a replica of the original. So, that really does, it's a nice kind of concrete illustration of certain dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, it also raises questions about whether or not Trump, as we'll come to, Trump will run for a third term because it's an ongoing project. So will it be completed? Is he going to, enjoy the fruits of his labor? But yeah, I agree with everything that you've said. It's very much symbolic of just getting things done, not getting bogged down in procedure. And also, it seems like it would be ripe for the kind of skewering where it's like a vision of opulence, spending all this money, even if it's kind of partially privately funded, on this sort of big ornate construction while most citizens are going through a kind of cost of living crisis, this sort of thing. But actually, it's right on brand, obviously, for Trump, because opulence is part of what Trump does and what he promises for everybody, as opposed to what had been the case where elites were sort of expected to perform austerity and pretend that they didn't live in riches. And it became this sort of thing like, well, also you people, citizens, are supposed to enjoy your austere, crappy existence. So, like, I don't know, Trump's kind of opulence has this wonderful democratic quality to it. So it makes perfect sense that the people's house should have an opulent ballroom in it. There's actually no contradiction there, which I find very interesting. The other thing is that the East Wing traditionally has been associated with the First Lady. Whereas Melania has distanced herself from this project and said, this has got nothing to do with me. It's the place where her office is, First Lady's offices typically would be. And I like the symbolism of that as well, because, I find it interesting that it's kind of demolishing this part of this part of the building that was associated with the First Lady's performance of her duties, and bring it back to the performance of femininity as things like ballrooms and dancing and for show. I think Trump made a comment about why this is necessary. Well, previously, the ladies had to walk across the grass in their high heels, and their high heels were going down into the dirt, several inches. He's talking about ladies in this very old-fashioned sense. And it's, I feel like it's kind of a statement about this Trumpist masculinity politics as against the politics of feminization that had been so powerful for so many years, in which we all had to pretend was really the only acceptable mainstream form of politics. And it's kind of sticking it to that and going back to an older sense of gender roles, of like building and constructing and ladies being for show and this sort of thing, that is weirdly, given how much feminization has been weaponized, almost refreshing. But yeah, the idea that you would kind of come into power and immediately demolish it is hilarious, because you're sort of talking about a waste of taxpayer funds. And then everyone who comes after is like, yeah, and I will make sure it's a waste of taxpayer funds by immediately demolishing and building something new.
There's definitely a certain Jacksonian element to Trump, which a lot of people have commented on. And I think of it in connection with the White House, not so much regarding this ballroom plan, but in terms of Trump's plan to host a UFC fight on the White House lawn in 2026 to celebrate the nation's 250th anniversary. And this is a very just kind of bold expression of kind of democratic sensibility. I'm going to bring this kind of downscale, vulgar, violent event to the People's House, and that's a kind of way of making a certain claim about the People's House. Now, Jackson, famously for his inauguration, after his inauguration, hosted a reception at the White House, which was conventional, and traditionally at such receptions, just the kind of local, dignitaries, respectable people, ministers, ambassadors, whatever, would come by. But Jackson enjoyed such fanatical and widespread popular support that the White House was mobbed by people of all classes and races who just came in and, did things like, standing on the furniture, trying to catch a glimpse of Jackson, just eating all the jelly, just sitting there eating jelly, just people who were hungry and had never been at such a gathering at a fancy reception. And so I think there is a parallel between the horror that Jackson, that was met with Jackson's kind of shepherding of the White House that's also something that you see in responses to what Trump is doing. And yeah, that's such an interesting point about Melania, refusing to take up the duties of the first lady. The kind of, here I am to talk about physical fitness or the importance of reading. Right, there are these sort of tasks that they're often given, and I do think Melania telegraphed that during the inauguration when she wore a very masculine dress. As you may recall, she had this kind of severe black hat and this kind of black double-breasted suit. It was very kind of it was a sort of exaggerated version of a masculine way of dressing. And then at one of the inaugural balls, she was wearing a kind of tuxedo dress. So it was kind of very, very fun and stylish and fashionable. But it was also a refusal to inhabit this kind of typical femininity, this sort of soft femininity, and I think that probably reflects Melania's sense that she's not there to kind of play a good, kind of reassuring suburban wife. That's not what she's there to do for Donald J. Trump. So you mentioned, Ashley, Trump pursuing a third term. This seems like something that is, maybe just more of a meme or a joke or kind of attempt to trigger the libs, but also unlike demolishing the movie theater in the East Wing, it would be unconstitutional. So it's runs counter to the American tradition. Only one president, the great FDR, has ever served a third consecutive term. And anyway, Trump's floating this idea. So what's going on there? Is this maybe something worthy of a little more concern?
Yeah, it's very difficult to tell because, as with a lot of things with Trump, he starts out by just sort of like trolling, trying to get a rise out of people. And then it's almost like he convinces himself over time that actually, hey, that might be a good idea. We should actually do this seriously. And I know, in all seriousness, I suppose Steve Bannon has been putting on this kind of campaign or, forwarding this idea of a Trump third term. But obviously on Monday, Trump denied that was something that he would do. And it was put forward to him that it could be done as a kind of, obviously it's unconstitutional, but a workaround might be that if the sitting president abdicates, to use the UK monarchy terms, then Trump might be able to take up the position again. He said, well, that would be legal, of course, but I wouldn't do that. So it's very difficult to tell. I was listening to Fox News and I found it so interesting how the commentators on there, the way that they were talking about it just reminded me so much of when the left was in power for such a long time. They were saying things like, oh, all of this rhetoric is really, really inflammatory. And it's amazing how they're just repeating disinformation like it's true. And they're talking about left-wing commentators who are saying Trump's going to have a third term. He's going to break the Constitution. He's a dictator, so on. And they're saying, they're just spreading this disinformation with impunity. And that's really dangerous, especially at a time when the far left is rising. And it just struck me how much we are still in that same predicament across the political spectrum where, perhaps for good reason, but, not without reason, I should say. There's this deep, deep distrust of the public that you could have this figure rise up and just sort of take power that easily, for the left, that is, and everyone would just kind of go along with it and that'd be fine. And then on the other hand, that simply talking about this is enough to make people sort of salivate at the mouth and go on a killing spree. And as I said, perhaps not without good reason, because there have been obviously violent incidents. We've got Charlie Kirk in very recent memory. Although you have to remember, you have a country of what's the population? Something like 360 million. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. Something crazy is bound to happen at some point. But the idea that you have to kind of be careful of what you say in public is lest, you create these like mobs of people, or people are simply just totally passive on the other hand, I think is an incredible insult to democracy and the democratic spirit. And I just noticed that it's absolutely everywhere. But in terms of this idea of a third term, obviously it would cause a huge crisis and controversy in the United States. The only real possibility is if there was some scheming going on to create that workaround for the Constitution. But I can understand why Trump might want to convince himself to scheme along these lines, because he might fear his own irrelevance. If he doesn't die in office, which seems unlikely, he's rather spry, what comes next for him? Does he become something like an Obama figure who tours stadiums giving horrible speeches to sold out crowds who've heard it all 1,000 times before? Does he sell playing cards as he's been doing and action figures? I can understand that there's a fear of irrelevance that surrounds this. And then, I don't know, just trying to think how to sort of connect this to Kamala saying that she's going to she's going to try again. So you can imagine the situation of like Trump versus Kamala round 2. But Kamala running again and even the idea that she would say this out loud speaks to the incredible disorientation on the part of the mainstream parties, not just in the United States, in a lot of countries, where they just absolutely do not understand why they have failed. Even that she would countenance this and say it out loud tells you that the so-called left, in terms of its mainstream representation, is so hopelessly tied to a cloistered professional class, still clinging desperately to the moment where they could feel like or claim that everything outside DEI and like trans rights was just completely unacceptable in public discourse, that they could just paint their enemies as completely fringe and unacceptable and they would win. And they're so desperate to go back to that moment. And they're completely unable to grasp that what the populist impulse is trying to speak to or is representing or giving voice to. And it reminds me of, Hillary Clinton coming out a few years ago trying to say a few things that would make her relevant again, and how much you got the idea that she wished it was the mid-90s, when the main problem was people's disaffection and people's lack of engagement with politics, where you could do like a rock the vote thing and get some celebrities to wear voter die t-shirts, and that would be like edgy because everybody was completely disengaged from politics. They loved that moment. That's what they want to go back to, when nobody cared and they could do what they want, this sort of like interest group democracy where they just had to listen to the NGOs, and there was just this revolving door between the NGO class and politics, that the Democrats have not moved beyond that. They're desperately trying to get back to that. That's extremely worrying, and the same thing is happening in the UK at the moment. All the mainstream parties are starting to disintegrate, and this is allowing for the smaller, newer parties like Reform to fill that space, who understand the disaffection of the electorate. I don't think that's possible in the United States. So it's quite interesting to see what would happen there, that there would be a gap, a space, a desire for populists like Trump to come in for a third term, however that might be possible. You could understand that, like, constitutionally this would cause a kind of crisis, but politically also there's a crisis in that there is no representation for the populist kind of upsurge. Excuse me. And nobody is willing to fill that void, and nobody can fill that void, possibly, maybe except JD Vance, in the way that Trump did. So yeah, I think I think that after Trump's next term is going to be very, very interesting. You can see the Democrats want to go back to the status quo. And do the Republicans have anything else besides Trump? Is that just, do they even know what they have in their hands? I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, I mean, some of us have been involved in trying to articulate what Trumpism after Trump would look like. And you saw quite a bit of that in the wake of the 2020 election. It was a bit premature because we were by no means after Trump at that point. And I think, one way to read this talk is just as an indication on the part of Trump and his loyalists that they don't believe in a Trumpism after Trump. It's the man, and that's it. It's not some kind of suite of post-liberal economic proposals and American kind of civic and cultural nationalism. It's one man and what he believes.
Well, that's not entirely off base, because you see so many politicians try to ape the language of Trump. And, you've got Kemi Badenoch famously in the UK, like, oh, she tells it like it is, and she's going to get away with it because she's black and she's a woman. But she still talks in such a scripted way. They just can't. They can't let someone just go out and talk. It's got to be focus groups. It's got to be workshops. They don't understand that what made populism so powerful was the authenticity, the fact that it didn't sound workshopped. I've said this 1,000 times, so I won't say it again. But people tying their fortunes too closely to Trump are in big trouble as well, because Trump is Trump. There's nothing like him, and he will say one thing one day and then something completely different the next day, and then you're in big trouble if you're a Farage or you're a Polyev or whatever. Yeah, Trump is just, I don't know, he's a one-of-a-kind, one-off kind of thing. I don't think he represents a kind of coherent politics, except an exhaustion with the old politics. What do you do then when the old politics is the only thing on the table?
Well, and indeed, he actually is arguably enacting many things that are still the old politics, obviously less so than in his first term. But if we turn to what's going on in Venezuela and the kind of escalation there, it's hard to see this as anything having to do with his broader appeal or the things that he ran on. It's just it's a reflection of a constituency within the Republican Party that has always existed, and one of these things that in various ways is able to get them out of this administration. And anyway, but that's a side point. The thing I wanted to bring up is related to Latin America, which is just that the drama of presidential reelection is so central to Latin American politics in a way that people who don't follow it don't tend to be aware of. And we published something by Juan Rojas on Bolivia recently, and that was one case of it where a very generally popular and successful figure, obviously controversial in some ways, but left populist leader Evo Morales, followed the same pattern as so many previous Latin American leaders in attempting to get around the constitutional prohibition on re-election. And in some countries, it has been prohibited customarily to serve more than one consecutive term. In some countries, like in the US, it's limited to 2 consecutive terms total. And we see in many, many countries, this becomes a kind of central drama that polarizes the country and brings about some sort of confrontation. And this was the case in Bolivia. And interestingly, another case that went in the opposite direction was El Salvador, which is now a key ally in the region of the Trump administration, where Bukele ran in spite of a prohibition on presidential reelection. Like Morales on the left, he did so in part because he was able to stack the Supreme Court with loyalists who would give him a pass and allow him to get around this prohibition. And so, this is just a very familiar drama in that part of the world. There are also various other ways that different ruling cliques have attempted to get around it. you'll have a husband serve, and then his wife will come in and serve a term in his stead, and then the husband. This is what was attempted in Argentina between the Kirchner couple, another kind of left populist formation in Argentina, where Nestor Kirchner served a term. He was prohibited from running for a second term. Then Christina Kirchner served a term. And then the idea was that Nestor would then come back in and serve another term. And so you'd still get this kind of continuity of rule. But the problem was Nestor dropped dead of a heart attack, so it didn't work out. But the point here is, this whole problem is a general feature of populist politics, specifically in Latin America. And it's notable that the most successful hegemonic populist formation in American history arguably was FDR's New Deal Democrats, which also became tied to this kind of Caesarist project of keeping FDR in power indefinitely. And so, I don't want to, there's a long kind of academic literature on Caesarism and where it comes from. Obviously, we can trace it back to the ancient world, as its name would suggest. But it does seem that when you have a populist politics that is in some ways pitted against some sort of oligarchy that has enjoyed power for a long time through structures, through procedures, through institutions, that what you end up with is a kind of Caesarist project. But this does go in different, where you have one man who is tasked with kind of representing and channeling the popular will over and against the designs of the oligarchy, and that this is just kind of a typical form that politics takes, and that constitutions are often structured in such a way as to prevent that outcome. And then there ends up being a struggle, and it can go in different ways. Morales was quite a popular leader and by many measures a successful leader in Bolivia, but his attempt to outstay his welcome in office did not really do him any favors and ended up weakening his base of support. My sense is that Trump is not probably not as well positioned as he would like to imagine, because he simply is not thus far very effective or even seemingly particularly interested in establishing a kind of durable hegemony. He is happy to remain the preferred vehicle of the politics of, let's say, roughly 35 to 40% of the population. And I'd say even within that, there are some probably kind of weak elements. And, you really need, FDR had a much broader base than that in terms of what he was able to establish that enabled him to remain in power as long as he did. And I don't get the sense that Trump or Trumpism is, it may prove able to do that, but I think it will only increase its divisiveness, which tends not historically to militate. And, we could bring up the Bukele example, which I brought up before. Where exactly that will go remains to be seen. But essentially the reason Bukele was able to stay in power is because he simply is very popular. He is much more popular than Trump is. And this means that he is able to get, it's not just a matter of stacking the Supreme Court on his side. His popularity is reflected in the people who staff the institutions that implement his agenda and that enable him to keep doing the things he does. And if you don't have that kind of broad base, it's not clear to me you can actually carry out this kind of a Caesarist project. And there are so many, it would be interesting to do a kind of scientific study of this, because there are so many examples from the Latin American context of these sort of Caesarist populist leaders attempting to get around the constitutional prohibition on re-election. And this has gone in all kinds of different ways. And it would be interesting to see, what kind of margin of popularity seems to be necessary in order to make that sort of thing work. And, it's notable that Venezuela was a case where for a while, Chavez did get around the prohibition on re-election. He stayed in power until he died. And, this left his project in the hands of the current president, Maduro, who's a far less effective figure at kind of galvanizing broad public support than Chavez was. Obviously, he also is facing far less propitious conditions in terms of the bottom line of the price of oil, but nonetheless, it does depend on various things, and I do think it's worth going into this historical archive because there are so many prior examples of populist projects turning into Caesarist projects of indefinite re-election against the Constitution. It's a familiar drama if we just expand beyond the American context and look at the Americas more broadly.
Trump will be 82 in 2028. Seems less than ideal if recent experience is any indication. One thing that's interesting about this is that the selection of J.D. Vance as Trump's running mate was taken, and I think quite reasonably, as a sign that Trump was interested in perpetuating a distinctive Trumpism, and that his children, Donald Trump Jr., played a large role in that selection, were interested in sustaining Trumpism after Trump was done serving. That was a choice that was so different from selecting Mike Pence, who was a more classic kind of balancing candidate. Okay, so Trump is our kind of economic nationalist, louche, vulgar presidential candidate, and Vice Pence is our reserved Midwestern, pious, evangelical, religious conservative, free marketeer running mate. So, yeah, there's a certain kind of ambivalence, I guess, or ambiguity in terms of the public signals that the administration is sending. Another sign of that divide in the Republican Party between a more kind of old line, economically liberal in the classical sense, and socially conservative right on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the new kind of Trump economic nationalist, louche right, is just the divide between Trump and DeSantis, between Trump world and the DeSantis stands. And I think that difference between those two Republican camps was cast into high relief when Andrew Tate came to the U.S., and he was welcomed and defended by various people in the Trump orbit. One of them is the Paul Ingrassia, the Republican operative we discussed last week, who served on the Tate's legal defense team. And DeSantis opened a criminal investigation against Andrew Tate when he landed in Florida. And I'm just totally on DeSantis' side in this. I'm sorry. I don't like the Tates. But there always is the issue of not just who you like and dislike, but also, what is the law and has it been broken, by whom and how? And though the criminal investigation of the Tates is ongoing and unresolved, we had an interesting development this week when a judge dismissed several kind of elements of a suit that a woman had brought against the Tates, saying that there was insufficient evidence for them. The Tates are still charged with defamation of the woman, but not with any of the more serious crimes she accused them of. So I just think it's interesting to watch as our legal system kind of sifts through the actions of the Tates and tries to reach certain valid legal judgments about them, which may be distinct from our moral judgments. Ashley, are you a Tate fan?
No, I am not a Tate fan. However, I will say that
I thought maybe you live in Europe. You're kind of multi-continental, international, sort of like they are. I thought maybe a certain sympathy, but I suppose not. Not really.
No, I've had my fair share of disgusting men in my life. No offense, present company not included, obviously. So yeah, I don't like to extend too much sympathy to these types of people, and it's particularly I remember as a young woman how much these slimy slime balls would prey on you, and yeah, I see what these men are doing, and it's horrifying and disgusting. On the other hand, I'm very glad that there is a distinction between my moral outrage at these disgusting pieces of trash and the legal threshold for prosecuting them. As much as I would like to see them get their just desserts, and I hope that they will soon, I think it's good that it's good that that it seems that moral outrage has not played a role here. So basically, the story is that this woman has accused the Tate brothers of luring her to Romania with promises of a quote unquote business relationship. It seems to me they use the lover boy technique, very common with pimps. And the idiot Tates were like talking about this, like they discovered it. Yeah, I just make the girls fall in love with me. Oh, wow. Super smart, man. You're the first person ever to think of that. Anyway, so that it seems to me like she said promises of a relationship. Obviously, very young woman. She's 23 now. So when all this happened, much younger, and when she got there, it was revealed that this was essentially a form of coercion to try to get her to be a webcam model. Very common thing that they've bragged about doing. However, the court said that her evidence did not live up to the legal threshold for quote unquote outrageous behavior, things like that. And her suffering did not meet the legal threshold. So throughout 6 out of 7 of the allegations, but kept the one of them, which was accusations of defamation, that the Tate brothers had defamed her. So she has, I think, 3 weeks or something like that to now pursue that charge. But yeah, so I am quite glad. Over and over and over again, I am pleased at the American justice system, at the American Constitution, how much it prevents some of the I'm not saying it's perfect by any means, and there are lots and lots of cases where things don't go right. But if you look at the situation in Europe, how much moral outrage has infected the criminal justice system, how much it has infected our politics, how much, and it's absolutely impossible to separate these things. People just they are so intent. So, and I when I say people, I mean like sort of like the commentariat, the sort of political class and sort of NGO class. These sort of well-to-do people just cannot seem to separate. I think that is wrong, and there ought to be a law that ought to be illegal. We ought to, arrest people for doing that. So you can have moral outrage. That's fine. Good. Be mad at people. Try to convince people not to follow them and to convince them to not do what they do. But to bring the police over, to charge people, to sue people, to do all these sorts of things, I think is a step too far, and it blurs. Obviously, to a certain extent, law codifies our moral outrage, but not everything that is bad ought to be illegal. And the temptation to use law as a substitute morality, I think, is obviously, it's a cliche to say it, but it is a step toward the banality of evil, where you no longer use your judgment and people say, well, this is allowed, ergo it must be good. And that is not true. Just because something is allowed does not mean it is good. Just because something that is bad doesn't mean it should be illegal. So yeah, I think that's a good thing. I think there are obviously broader questions. I think how you sort of introduced this segment was really apt, because it is kind of an issue how to deal with people like Tate and the elements of the MAGA movement that it represents, and generally as a kind of constituency of populism. You have this very uneasy juxtaposition of Christian conservatives and the kind of libertine, pornified, hyper-masculine kind of elements of the right, that I think that there are a lot of issues that are begging to be politicized, and that many elements of the MAGA movement, or that populists want to politicize but can't, because to do so would rip open that very delicate suture within the movement between these two kinds of groups. And one of them is pornography. Very interestingly, in the magazine today, that is Tuesday, in Compact, we have an article by Joe Bartosh and Robert Jessel about their new book, Pornocracy. And when I was talking to Joe about the book, she said that it's actually really hard to get right-wing outlets to touch the book, to review it. They just don't want to open that can of worms. And therefore, we as a society are not able or willing to have that deep conversation about the fact that these things are bad. You shouldn't do them. And it's funny because we've touched on this topic a few times in Compact. We've got another piece, a very good piece by Stephen Ajibato about porn. And immediately people were like, "Oh, we should make it illegal then? Is that what you're saying? We should just make it illegal?" And people can't just say, "No, it shouldn't be illegal, but you shouldn't watch it. It's bad for you." Like, it's a vice. Remember that? It's going to be bad for your relationship. It's going to hurt your relationship with your partner, your wife, or even getting one. Just don't do it. And we can't even have that conversation or make that distinction. So this is the kind of trouble that we're at. And I could say a lot more about the Tate brothers, but Jeff, I'll let you speak.
I don't have that much to add to that. I do think there's sort of this trajectory for the past couple of decades around these sort of masculinity influencers. And obviously you can trace it back to, in the aughts, this was it started to be called the manosphere. This is a big part of Angela Nagel's argument in Kill All Normies, as to the origins of the online right, the alt-right, really come out of this realm. And it's obviously a significant factor that isn't going away and is in some ways seeming to curdle into something even ever uglier in the case of the Tates. And this is in spite of the immense attempts to stigmatize and marginalize it, and the kind of panics around toxic masculinity and so on that surged in the 2010s. And so, this really is there's a long arc of this set of developments and this particular cultural formation that you can trace. And in some ways, the early sort of pickup artists and so on look almost kind of quaint and innocent compared to some of the stuff that you see today. But and then there's also we don't talk about this that much, but the incel, the kind of self-conscious incel groupings online that are sort of part of this broad manosphere. And obviously, there's just something deeply amiss in terms of our, current relations between the sexes that all of this is symptomatic of. And I do sort of think this ultimately it ties into an argument I've made in the Substack a few times, but that maybe I'll try to make more forcefully at some point, which is that I don't know. I mean, I'm curious what Matthew thinks of this, but I do think that sort of social conservatism has a particular role to play in how the culture responds to these sorts of developments. Because in a sense, what's happened is that a lot of the response to this has been this kind of feminist pushback and this kind of demonization of toxic masculinity and so on, which in many ways has simply exacerbated, it's the sort of the rift between the sexes that this is symptomatic of has been exacerbated and kind of symmetrically symptomatized by the reaction to it by the feminist left. And I think part of what this shows is this kind of lack of any vision of the family, of some kind of productive complementarity between the sexes, that all of that has been shattered. And in some ways, and many of our online dynamics are sort of. And I think another point here that's crucial about it's amazing how often this comes up when you read the kind of older literature about the history of the internet, is that from the beginning you can find people discussing the fact that the internet is a space in which, sex and gender can kind of be suppressed or bracketed or kind of replaced with performance. And so you can find all kinds of examples of this. I was just reading a book, a 1999 academic book by Catherine Hales called How We Became Post-Human. And the first instance of what it means to be post-human that she illustrates is the kind of degendering and desexing of the online avatar. And so there is just this kind of fundamental way in which the way that we exist online creates this crisis for relations between the sexes on all kinds of levels. And I do sort of think I'm not convinced that social conservatism has responded all that robustly to this set of developments. I mean, I imagine I'm missing some cases of people who have, but I guess what I'm interested in here is that the strongest kind of moralizing reactions to this whole collection of developments have really come from like the feminist left, which is, far too kind of invested in and symptomatic itself of this set of effects to actually be able to, respond to them in a way that doesn't simply propel them forward and kind of accelerate many of these trends. So I don't know, that's a little vague, but I'm struck by, and it's not, all that connected to the Tates per se, but I'm struck by the way that, as bad as all these sort of these sort of trends have been for decades, it does seem to me the Tates have, are symptomatic of the way that this kind of online masculinity dynamic has somehow gotten even worse, and more horrifying, and yet, I don't think the kind of legal remedy that's being proposed here is at all relevant ultimately, because this is it's an expression of a deep kind of social and cultural malaise that ultimately needs to be responded to on the social and cultural level.
I'm so desperate to jump in here. Can I just say, you said it was a problem between the sexes. I think it's a problem between the generations, because we've completely poisoned the relationship between boys and men. Like, how are you supposed to learn how to be a man? That's why all these lost boys are going to Tate. They don't know how to behave themselves. Because I was just walking through town with my husband because it's Ohi Day. And I was shocked by how many young men my husband knew. And I was like, how do you know these? He's like saying hi to everybody. He plays soccer, and he's the oldest man on the team, and they're the youngest. And he's always taken this position of like, if he sees a lost boy, and he doesn't even realize he's doing it. He sees a lost boy, he invites him over to our house, gets him to cut our lawn, paint our walls, put our furniture together, and we'll have dinner or coffee with them or something like that. And that's how I don't know how, he doesn't even think about it. But this is what a village boy does. This is what they did for him. This is how he became a man. That he learned by having all of these relationships with older men. Now I say that, and I bet you guys want to giggle a little bit, don't you? How many young boys my husband knows. Like, that's, when you poison relationships like that, it's not just a man thing. It's a problem for all of us. We're not growing up because we have all these little age cohorts. We need to foster non-institutionalized relationships between men and boys. Yeah. Can we do that? No, not without a deep vetting procedure beforehand.
Yeah, that is great. In terms of the internet and how it's kind of changed these sexual dynamics and just gender relations, I think of this book, The Two Revolutions, that came out a couple of years ago. It's a history of how the internet, the technological revolution of the internet, enabled the social revolution of the emergence of transgender identity as something that had public recognition and a kind of public status. And it's just just goes through archival material, kind of early forums and whatever email lists and whatnot, and shows how this new communications technology enabled the formation of a group with a certain self-consciousness and political identity. And something like that is true as well of this kind of online masculinism, because the kind of identity that Tate is projecting, I mean, it's not novel. It's downstream of the Hugh Hefner thing, but it's also a little different. It's more into the weightlifting, which I don't think was part of the Playboy mix. The idea that the man had to be looks maxed, had to be this very physically impressive and imposing thing. I don't think that was really part of it. He was the Playboy, the kind of international man of mystery, who was, suave and rich and well dressed, but he didn't have to be as physically impeccable as the woman, right? But anyway, there's almost this kind of a male to male kind of gender transition that the young man being initiated into this world has to undergo. He is a sort of non-man, right? But he has to start taking supplements, maybe drugs. He has to reshape his body. He has to come to inhabit a male identity, which will be defined by his looks and by the way he dresses and by the projection of a certain something, rather than by his pairing with a woman and having children by her and raising those children in the village, right? It's distinct from a kind of traditional way of achieving manhood. It's a way of achieving manhood that I think is more parallel to the way someone who's gender transitioning might do so.
Chad surgery.
Yeah, you got to go. Is that a thing? Did they ever go under the knife, or is it really just about getting got the chemicals in there and go to the gym?
Mewing and all that.
I know.
Get under the barbells rather than the knife.
Chad surgery is definitely a meme. I feel like I've seen people screen cap posts of people who claim to have undergone Chad surgery, but I don't know to what extent this corresponds to something real in the world. But it certainly corresponds to a fantasy.
Right.
Yeah, these people, they don't know how to be men.
But I think that comes out of the incel, the sort of incel obsession with physiognomy, that, if you don't have the right physiognomy, you're simply cursed and cast out from society. And so you must transform yourself in order to change your social status.
Yeah, I mean, anything to avoid
instead
just
of getting a job, holding it.
Yeah,
exactly. Marrying a woman, having some children, hiring the guy at the soccer field to paint your house. Just kind of doing.
Don't even hire him. You should just be the kind of person that will come over and do it because you're part of the community.
Right. Well, thanks to Ashley and to Geoff. Thanks to our producer, Stephen Adebato. For more, go to compactmag.com/subscribe. There you can read Death of Sex, Murder of Love, great piece on pornification that Ashley Frawley mentioned.